The topics this morning are going to be lust and divorce. So we're going to get into lust and divorce and what Jesus has to say about those things this morning. As I was wrestling this last week and preparing, sometimes I like to try and come up with some kind of a story on the front end to grab people's attention and to try and connect with us on a practical level to the topic we're going to be discussing. I very quickly went, I don't need to do that this week. When I bring up those two things, lust and divorce, I know that it draws out a lot of different thoughts in the room. There's many fears and anxieties, and there's pain. There are countless stories and situations in the room represented that reach out to all these branches off of these two topics. And I'll just tell you, this last week I felt a tremendous weight. Am I really hot in the room, or am I just are my ears just open? Am I loud? Am I okay? You might bring me down, Ted, because this is like. What did I say? Don't worry about the second question, just the first one. That's true. I just want to be honest because this is not just the next text that we were supposed to get into for the Sermon on the Mount. This one is really personal to me. It has a lot to do with my personal story. I'm not abstracted from the ideas that I'm going to be talking about this morning. This is all up in my business, okay? Many of you, if you know me really well, you know a little more of my testimony, but some of you don't know a lot of my personal story. But on these two issues, these two things touch the heart of some places in my life that I don't like to think about from my past. I'm sexually broken myself. I'll share a little bit more about that later. I come from a home of multiple divorces and remarriage. My wife and I got married, and both of us came from homes that were broken with divorce and remarriage and all the things that come along with that. There's sexual abuse in my background. And I don't say that to get sympathy from you. I just say that to say that when Jesus is speaking into these things, he's speaking into my story as I know he's speaking into yours as well. Okay? So I recognize I want to take this really seriously, and I do take this very seriously this morning because I know that many of us are bringing some real deep wounds and pain on a variety of topics around these two things. But if you're new with us, I just wanted to say a couple things right up front. One, if you're new to Refuge, one thing we take really seriously is loving Jesus and following him. And part of loving him and following him means we want to lean into every single thing that he says. We want to take seriously his words to us. We really want to believe every word that comes out of his mouth. And so what that means is when things get really personal and uncomfortable and he touches on places that cause us to react, we want to lean into what Jesus says, not shy away from what Jesus says. Okay, so this morning as we come together, we're leaning in together, okay? All of us, we're on this journey and hearing from Jesus together. And so no matter where you're at in your walk with him or what your thoughts on sexuality are or on marriage and divorce and remarriage, no matter the pain of your past, we're coming to him this morning and saying, Jesus, where we're hurt, would you heal us? Where we're confused, Jesus, would you teach us? Where we're being prideful and rebellious, would you humble us? That's all of us in the room, okay? So will you commit to leaning in with me this morning into the uncomfortable? Good. If you start getting up and leaving, I won't chase you down. Just open the doors and I'll talk louder and we'll keep teaching. I'm just kidding, truly. But four things before we get into this. This is not in your notes, but this is just something I want to say right off the bat. Four things kind of introductory before we get into our text. Number one is when Jesus speaks the words he's speaking this morning, he's not doing so in a way to blacklist or to cancel or to bring condemnation upon the hearers. Often when these texts are referred to that I grew up in the church, these texts were often used as a club to wield, to hammer people over the head and lead to shame and condemnation, where the focus was all on past, not on discipleship and what does it mean to follow Jesus into the future, okay? We need to remember that Jesus here, of course, he is holding up the righteousness of the kingdom to show us we can't meet that standard and to point to him and his work, but he's not speaking these words to cancel and condemn people. There are lust-filled people in the crowd this day that he's preaching these words. There are lots of divorcees in the crowd as he's speaking these words. It was very common. We'll get into that later. He's not seeking to cancel or condemn. He's actually going to build his kingdom with people who have all kinds of past that he wants to redeem and lead them into something new. The second thing, please stay with me the whole time this morning. Okay, I know when it comes to these topics, you may have an assumption of where I'm going. I'm going to ask for some borrowed trust lean in, stick with me, okay? There's going to be some uncomfortable things maybe spoken this morning that come from the word this morning. I just want to invite you, stay with me. Okay, don't jump to conclusions. Third thing, this is kind of for me to remind myself of this. I can't possibly cover all of the branches and all of the questions that come off of these two topics this morning. When I'm preparing for a message, how I work is I will work through the text, start to pull out things, and then as I make a statement on a sheet of paper, my mind immediately goes, okay, now what are all the questions that could arise from that statement? This last week was a panic attack waiting to happen, trying to do that. Because I'm like, well, if I say this, then these 10 people with these 10 circumstances could ask. Can't do all of that this morning. What we're going to do is look at what Jesus teaches as a foundational launching point for discipleship, not a landing zone. Hey, that's really important. I can't cover all of the things. I know there's lots of stories and circumstances in the room. Can't cover it all, but I can tell you my heart is motivated by love for you all this morning. So anything that I bring up and I share, I'm trying to be faithful to what Jesus is teaching. And the hope is that it would spark conversation and questions and leaning in. The Sermon on the Mount, we talked about it, is this holistic picture of being a disciple of Jesus, which is a learner, which means I'm looking at him, I'm going to keep following after him. When questions come up, I'm not going to run away. I'm going to lean in. Ask those questions. If you don't come to Pursuit, I invite you to come. This week is going to be so much fun. It's going to be intense this Wednesday. All right, the fourth thing, and this is the big idea. If you're a note taker, this is in your bulletin notes. The fourth thing is I think Jesus wants to do two things in this text simultaneously. The big idea is this. Jesus wants to honor and uphold God's beautiful design for marriage and sexuality. And he also wants to meet those who have been through divorce or are battling lust with his grace. Two things happening at once, okay? He does want to say, hey, I have a better way for you. Lean in and hear from me. And he wants to say, I know most of you have not been walking in this beautiful way that I've given you. There is grace and forgiveness and mercy. I'm inviting you to lean in and learn from me. Those two things are not opposed. They hold hands beautifully. All right, so let's dive in. This morning, this is kind of be two sermons. I am watching the clock, but we cut a song so I could have extra time this morning. Jesus is going to continue on in his you've heard it said, or the common cultural phrase, or the common thing that you believe kind of in your religious culture is this. Now I say, here's the righteousness of the kingdom. Starting in verse 27, Matthew chapter 5. I'm going to read verses 27 and 28. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. First point in your notes this morning, got 5 things. Unbridled lust dehumanizes image bearers. Unbridled lust dehumanizes image bearers. Jesus is speaking into a cultural moment here. There's a couple things. We set this foundation at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and there were 2 important things for us to know that Jesus was speaking into. One was this is the period of history known as Second Temple Judaism. Okay, so Jesus is speaking into the Second Temple Judaistic culture, and what you need to know about that culture is that it was a very patriarchal system and structure. And look back now, you could say even misogynistic at times in the cultural period of the day. And what I mean by that is women were seen as second-class citizens, often viewed as property, did not have voting rights. They simply were not on par with men in this culture that Jesus is speaking into. That's important to note. And the second thing is, it's the Greco-Roman world. Very sexually progressive. And so the Jewish culture is trying to find itself and figure out what does it mean to be a God-honoring people in the midst of this Roman culture where there's all this sexual brokenness all around them. And so one of the threads that's going to weave through both of these topics today and why we didn't separate them is that Jesus wants to honor the dignity and value and worth of women in these passages. And that is really, really important for us to grasp. We need to see this. So he's stepping into Second Temple Judaism, this patriarchal society, and saying, hey, men, you say, hey, I haven't committed adultery, but I'm telling you, if you look lustfully at a woman and dehumanize them as an object of pleasure in your mind, you have actually already committed adultery in your heart. Jesus wants to make a point. Women are co-heirs with men as those who bear the image of God and the dignity of God. And what he's doing here, as much as we're leaning into that culture, so sometimes we hear this and say, all right, this is just for the guys this morning. Not true, okay? Ladies, you don't get out of this either. What he's doing is elevating men and women, saying men and women are made in the image of God. They're more than just objects of pleasure for us to use to fulfill our own desires. Men and women bear the image of God. And when we look at them lustfully, we're actually dehumanizing them in our mind and our heart. So Jesus is actually trying to dive into the cultural religious teaching of the day is this, well, the letter of the law says, just don't commit adultery. And they could get around that really easily with certificates of divorce, which we'll talk about here in just a bit. But essentially they would say, hey, look, we don't divorce, or we don't commit adultery on our wives. We're not sleeping around all over, so we're good. And Jesus is going, no. That's not true devotion to God. True devotion to God goes beyond the external. It shows up in the heart when our thoughts, our desires, and our actions all are in alignment. That's true devotion to God. So when Jesus says here, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say to you, when the secret thoughts of your heart and the fantasies that you linger on in your mind are drawn out to the point where you objectify another image bearer of God in your lust, you are an adulterer. So at this point, Jesus knows when he says this, everybody in the crowd is cooked. I'm assuming everybody in this crowd probably feels very similarly. Who among us hasn't done this? They're hearing this and going, what on earth, Jesus, are you serious? This is impossible. How? If this is the kingdom of God, then I'm out. All of us are out. No one is amening at this point of Jesus' sermon. They're all going, what are you saying? Jesus, now remember, he's not seeking to condemn, but he is seeking to uphold the righteousness of the kingdom. He's trying to cripple their idea that they could be truly righteous in their own merit and through their own efforts. And he's trying to restore honor and dignity to a culture that's been torn apart by sexual sin. So that's first century, Second Temple Judaism. Let's talk about where we're sitting now and the cultural moment that we are living in now. We're going to talk about pornography here in just a minute. So just to let you know, just to make you aware. But for all of us in the room, when we hear this and when they're hearing this, the temptation is to start to argue. Wow, that's ridiculous. I can't control that. Like there's so many things. How am I supposed to, in our culture, like it's everywhere. How do you expect me to not look with my eyes when everywhere I go or I drive, when I turn on the TV, it's everywhere. And here's the thing. As much as we want to argue with Jesus, our consciences bear witness that he's telling the truth. We know this because we experience shame when we engage in the thing that Jesus is talking about here. Jesus is right. People are not objects to be consumed by our passions. People are not eye candy or trophies of conquest. People are not the sum of their total sexual availability and attractiveness. That's not who we are. Our bodies are not meant to just be basal instruments of pleasure. But we live in a world and in a culture where we've reduced sexuality down to the firing of synapses and base urges inside of us, and it is killing us. How many of you have heard of the Fight the New Drug? Has anybody heard of that in the room? Okay, if you have not, and this is something you wrestle with, please go look it up. Fight the New Drug. It's an amazing organization that's essentially just doing a lot of research into the effects of pornography on a society and on a people. There's a lot of amazing resources on there. And one of the things as I was looking at that this last week, we're a couple decades into now how pornography has always, like lust has been a thing since humanity has existed, but we live in a society that's just been really sexualized, and pornography, especially now because of the internet and the access. There's been decades now of research being done, and a study from actually 2014 by the University of Cambridge, secular study by the way, this is research that took place over 2 decades. Here's a conclusion that they came to. Say this, porn takes our brain's natural stimuli, our desire for intimacy and connection, our longing to feel solid or desirable in our relationships, our interest in a particular feature or activity, and gives us more quantity, more exaggerated and more supernormal, meaning it's not normal what we're looking at, versions of that thing until it can override what we think is normal, warp what we perceive as exciting, and I want to key in on this, make real intimacy seem less interesting by comparison. This is a secular study saying here's what happens when people continually objectify other image bearers of God for their own pleasure. It actually warps and distorts the mind to such a point where you're separated from reality, and intimacy with human beings becomes increasingly difficult. As I'm saying these things, I know that there's people in the room going, yeah, I know. I feel that. There's an NIH, National Institute of Health study. This was done, I think, 15 years ago now, that was really eye-opening, where they were actually demonstrating the effects of the brain, pornography use and the effects on the brain. And what they showed was there's this dopamine release, of course, in your brain whenever you view pornography or even lust after another. And I won't get into all the details of some other things. We do have some younger ears in the room. And what they demonstrated is that the part of the brain that is rewarded in that moment is the same part of the brain that's rewarded by dopamine when you go buy something you really want. Or guys, when you'd be at Home Depot looking at a new tool. Ladies, maybe you like to build and stuff too, right? It's like when you make a purchase on Amazon. The same part of the brain is rewarded with dopamine. Literally wiring our brain to view human beings made in the image of God as objects for our selfish pleasure. And we live in a culture where this is everywhere. By the way, I know, as I'm saying this is not an out there problem. It's an in here problem. I know we're at church and we're not supposed to be honest. Okay? I know this is an in here problem as well. Now listen, as I say all of this, Jesus is not anti-desire. He's not anti-sex. He created it. Okay? Jesus is anti some things though. He's anti-objectification. He's anti-abuse. He stands against the abuse that we inflict on others through our hidden addictions. You might say, how are you inflicting abuse on somebody? Listen, when it warps your brain to the point that you would rather use them for your own pleasure than speak to them and know them and view them as a human being, that's abusing them. And it's abuse to yourself whenever you warp, your conscience starts to participate with your broken desires as abuse inflicted upon ourselves. And Jesus says, this is not the way. Listen, you think when you can abide by the letter of the law, you're like, well, I'm not doing anything externally. It's all just in here. It's not harming anybody. He says, no, this is an affront to the living God when you dehumanize men and women made in my image. And he takes it really seriously. How seriously? Well, let's keep reading. Verses 29 and 30. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, I know we don't like to get honest in church, by the way, but adults in the room, I hope you're seeing what Jesus is pointing to here, okay? And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Point number 2 this morning, Jesus calls his disciples to war against unbridled lust. He wants us to see it how he sees it. He wants us to see that when we're walking in unbridled lust, when we're looking at pornography and pretending that there aren't real people on the other side of that screen and we're using them for our own personal pleasure, hey, you're dehumanizing them. He says, hey, if you're my followers, I want you to be willing to wage war against this in your mind and in your heart. So there's 2 readings of this. One is to go, okay, this is just figurative. He doesn't mean that. What he really means is fill in the blank. So we'll say a concept, over-theorize and over-conceptualize it in such a way where you actually avoid accountability to it. Like, well, that's just crazy, so he must mean something else, so we're just going to kind of move on and ignore it. Or the other side, which is just ridiculous on its face, right, is to take this super literally, like, Mame Fest 2025, all right, let's get out the saws and the spoons. That's obviously we hear that, we're like, okay, that's kind of ridiculous. We're not doing that. That's not how we roll. That doesn't make sense, okay? So what happens is on both ends of the spectrum, we can actually avoid the intensity and the weight of what Jesus is saying by over-conceptualizing it to, he's just kind of making a point that I don't really want to dig into. I'll just kind of walk away. Or that's just so ridiculous on its face. He can't mean that. And so we walk away. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has a commentary on this text. I love this. He says that it's really simple. The fact that we don't receive an answer to the question, is this figurative or literal, only makes this commandment more inescapable. Wait, what? Jesus doesn't explain. Why? He wants us to hear this and go, whoa. I need to sit on that for a second. What on earth is Jesus getting at? Am I supposed to gouge my eye out and chop my hand off, right? Let me help you a little bit. So I've been in ministry for a number of years now, and I honestly can't even recount all the times I've had someone come to my office and confess a pornography addiction. And I don't mean a little struggle. I mean like a crippling addiction that's wreaking havoc in someone's life. And not only have I counseled others in it, but I'm intimately acquainted with that struggle myself. One of the most painful days of my life was less than a year into my marriage when I had to confess to my new bride my own porn addiction because she caught me in it. I didn't confess it myself. And I know there are many people here in the same boat that right now you're honestly sitting here thinking, man, I really wish I hadn't come today. It's Super Bowl Sunday. I could have slept in. I don't want to think about this. I don't want to wrestle with this. Maybe you're here struggling with lust, or you have a full-blown porn addiction, and then you open this passage and it's like, whoa, Jesus is really serious about this lust thing that I'm dealing with. And then he speaks this harsh and even violent sounding word. And I think what Jesus is driving at is, hey, I want you to see this how I see it. I want you to hate this unbridled lust like I hate it because it is objectifying to human beings made in the image of God. And the question is, are you willing to wage war against this thing in your life? Are you willing to take examination of your heart and your mind and say, man, where am I vulnerable to run into this temptation? Where am I falling into this? And am I willing to make hard decisions to wage war against lust? Here's what will happen in a counseling scenario. This has happened. I've done it myself, and I've heard others in counseling situations do the same thing. I'll ask, hey, where's your greatest place of vulnerability? Inevitably, I tell you, especially in the last 15 years, it's always the same thing. Well, it's my smartphone. It's with me all the time. I can stow away at any moment. I can just go to the bathroom and I can pull it up and look at it. The inevitable follow-up, okay, would you be willing to put down your smartphone and get a no internet access phone for a while in order to take Jesus seriously, because you take this thing seriously and you recognize he's your Lord and Savior and you want to lay that thing down? And I say that, and I know we're people of grace, and it's like, well, hold on. This is a heart issue, so you can get rid of the externals. Listen, Jesus can set you free in an instant from sexual sin. He could do it. He could do it. He's good. Sometimes he does. Pray for it. Sometimes he wants to grab your hand and walk with you through years of sanctification. And it's difficult. And on that process, he's going to look at you and say, are you willing to lay this thing down? Listen, if you've ever dealt with any other kind of addiction, you know, if you're an alcoholic, to get sobered up, one of the steps is get away from the bottle. My grandfather was a man that I only knew as a godly man who loved Jesus, and he was one of the most amazing men in my life. He was an alcoholic for a little over 50 years, so my mom and aunts and uncle knew him differently, and they'd tell me stories, and I'm like, that's not Papa Buck. I don't even know who you're talking about. That's a different man, and it was. Jesus came in and made him a new creation, and he was a different man when I met him. But when I talked to him about this, he told me, when I gave my life to Jesus, I got a new job, we moved towns, I got rid of all my friends, and I remember I'm like, good night, Papa Buck, that seems like it's pretty intense. He said, listen, I gave my life to Jesus, and I recognized that I was destroying myself with this addiction and wrecking my marriage and ruining my family, and I was willing to do whatever it took. Say, Jesus, I want to take you seriously. He knew he was saved by grace. It wasn't to go earn salvation. He said, I want to take Jesus seriously, so I want to get rid of it. This is similar when we talk about this. And here's what happens, okay? This has happened in my own life and in counseling situations. We get to that point in the conversation. All right, so your phone's an issue. Do you have to have a smartphone? Well, not really. Okay, well, why don't you just, for now, let's just put that aside and get a no internet phone. Well, what about my email? That's an actual thing that I've heard someone say to me in my office. Well, what about my email? Sometimes I need to check my email when I'm at home. And I say, well, do you need to? Or are you just used to doing that? There's some work home balance too, you know, there's some other conversations. Do you really need it? I remember in that scenario, I was sitting there thinking, brother, your family's been wrecked. You're being wrecked. Your marriage is in shambles. Like you're struggling with intimacy. It's at a point where you're telling me that you go to work and you can't look women in the eye. I think email is not a high thing on your priority list in your life right now, okay? Let's be willing to say, Jesus, I really love you enough that this may cause me a little bit of discomfort and I might have to figure out some things practically, but if you love him enough and you say, this is enough of an issue that I hate it like he hates it, are we willing to wage war? Jesus is shouting to us, hey, I'm not here to shame you. I'm trying to save you. I love you. This addiction is destroying you. Are you willing to wage war against it. And again, and I got to tell you, I got a confession. I've counseled people over the years, and sometimes because I'm a gospel guy, I've been like, well, all the things that Covenant Eyes and the X3 Watch, those are great tools, but they don't really do anything to help you in your heart. Like, we need to get the heart. And I realized, just to be honest with you, that's really bad advice. The problem with pornography addiction, again, let me give the out, and Jesus can heal you in an instant. I've seen him do it. The problem is you've wired your brain with a lot of really bad decisions in a way where you've got to rewire your brain. And one of the best things you can do is to take practical steps to say, I want to war against this thing. Pray that the Lord would heal your heart. The goal is not just to stop doing the thing externally. The goal is for the Lord to help you to have your mind renewed by the washing of his word so that no longer do you view human beings made in the image of God as instruments of pleasure for your own satisfaction, but that you actually value them enough to see them differently. That's the hope in the heart. And Jesus says, hey, I want to change you. Are you willing to make some decisions to wage war against this thing? Celebrate Recovery. Quick plug. We're here, Ruben and Shauna. By the way, just remember that the whole time this morning. So the question is, when what you want and what Jesus are calling you into, what he's calling you to, when those two things are in conflict, what you desire and what you know Jesus is calling you to, who wins that battle? Think about that. Doing church, here's the danger of doing church. When we show up to church and we hear a sermon and we just think of it as, well, this is new information. I love to hear this sermon, or I was entertained, or whatever it may be. And we forget that Jesus actually says, hey, when you hear my word, you're supposed to respond to it and do something with it. When we keep kicking that down the road, right, we are missing out on the beauty of what Jesus wants to do in our life. We've talked about this before, but overseas, there's a lot of people who use Discovery Bible Study. That's not the right word. I'll think of it later maybe. But there's actually a discipleship process. I've talked about this, where they'll come together as the church and they'll teach. They'll get back together the next week, and the teacher will say, all right, how many of you did what we talked about last week? And if they say no, they'll say, well, we're not moving on then. Let's talk about it again. I don't want to do that because I don't want to teach on this every week, okay? So in all seriousness though, Jesus is saying, hey, if you're right now feeling that tug on your heart and you're like, oh, but it would be uncomfortable to get rid of this, just get rid of it. Get rid of it. Listen, I've got a dumb iPhone now. And I'll be honest with you, there are times where I'm like, man, I kind of miss being able to just pull up Facebook. And then I get on Facebook in the office and I go, maybe I don't miss that as much as I thought I did, right? Are you willing? Jesus is not saying, hey, I want to shame you. I'm here to condemn you. He says, hey, this is going to destroy you. I love you. You need to wage war against it. Hate it like I hate it, because it's devastating to your soul. All right. Sermon 1 is done. Okay? We'll come back to application on that later. I've got time. I'm watching the clock. Now let's get to the fun one. Now we're going to shift gears a little and talk about divorce, but it's important because there's going to be some concepts that kind of run together here. Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. All right, number 3. Any cause divorce dehumanizes image bearers. Any cause divorce dehumanizes image bearers. So the reason, again, we paired these things together, and the reason Jesus is saying these things back to back is the common thread between them really is redeeming the dignity of women and redeeming the view of sexuality in the culture. This is not just jumping topics. Again, stay with me this morning. On these couple of verses, I've probably heard some of the worst teaching, just to be honest with you, practically. And when I say worst, what I mean is not that there's a ton of sermons out there on this topic, but when there are bad sermons on this topic, they can be devastating to the minds and hearts of people who want to follow Jesus. Because some of the things that have been done with this text is, again, it's been picked up and wielded as a club to hammer people with instead of actually pulling out what is Jesus really getting at here, okay? And there are countless others who maybe have stayed in abusive marriages out of fear of religious shame because of these verses. I'm going to touch on that later, okay? Again, I know the questions. Write them down, okay? We'll talk about them later. If that's you on either account, though, if you've been hurt by it, I just want to say I'm sorry. I've been praying for you fervently this week. This one touches my life and my story and even relationship with my parents. There's a lot of things in here, okay? But just stay with me because I don't think Jesus is trying to do either of the things I just mentioned there. I think there's some context here that's really helpful. So again, Jesus says, hey, you've heard it said to those of old, and what he's going to talk about here is any cause divorce, and we'll see that more in Matthew 19. But any cause divorce was the common practice of the day, and it came from a really loose, terrible interpretation of Deuteronomy 24:1. Micah, go ahead and throw it up there. I'm going to try and run here. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. There's a whole lot more that comes after this, but this is really where they pulled it from. And you could basically, if you want to understand how they viewed it, you could stop at, and then she finds no favor in his eyes, just stop right there, and then jump to the certificate of divorce. That's really what was being taught. And the language of indecency here, they would take to mean anything that they wanted it to mean, when really what was being said here, indecency is actually talking about sexual immorality. It's not a command or a concession to divorce under any cause. It's not suggesting that at all, okay? But it's allowing for it on the grounds of sexual immorality, as Jesus says in Matthew 5. Now hang with me. Because over time, here's what's happened. Rabbis have interpreted the language of find some indecency in her to mean you are free to divorce your wife over anything you don't like or come to not appreciate about her. This is a real thing that really happened. She burnt the toast, any cause divorce. That's not a joke. It's literally what was going on. You're walking down the road, you're married, but you see someone that you think is more attractive, more desirable. You find out she's single, any cause divorce. As long as you give your wife the certificate, you can go ahead and go find you a new wife. This was the Jewish rabbinical teaching of the day. And in their hypocrisy, they claim themselves to be guiltless of adultery. And all the while, they're treating women like property and like sexual objects and then tossing them to the side at their discretion. And here's what's happening in this culture. Women had no ability or means to make a life for themselves if they did not have a husband. And so men were casting women aside like property and throwing them out in the street, and they had to come up with a way to try to make a living on the street. This is why when you look back and see when divorce is granted, I'm going to get ahead of myself, right? There's a heart there for making sure that women have a way to not be homeless on the street, starving and dying. That is very important for us to understand here. And the religious people of the day are like, hey, we're good. Because we're not committing adultery, because listen, we gave them the certificate of divorce. Yeah, I know I left her because she burnt my toast, but I gave her the paperwork. It was the proper paperwork so she could go figure it out, you know. Jesus is like, you are missing the point completely. That is a horrific, unjust justification for your sin. You're adhering to the letter of the law, which you've twisted and contorted, but you're missing the heart of the law. Now, Jesus' more broader teaching on divorce in Matthew 19. Jump over there with me if you'd like. I'm going to give you, this is kind of the simple, again, not all the branches, but number 4 in your notes, Jesus calls his disciples to a high view of the marriage covenant. A high view of the marriage covenant. Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 3. It says, and Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Here's how we normally read that. Is there any reason to get divorced? That is not what they are asking. They're saying, don't you agree with us that any cause divorce is right? Look at how Jesus answers. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So Jesus responds to their question about what they can get away with in divorce by talking about the sanctity and the permanence and the beauty of God's design for marriage. It's like, wait, Jesus, you didn't answer the question. No, I did. That any cause divorce language, you need to get rid of that. That is horrific. God designed marriage to be permanent, dignified, till death do we part. They respond in verse 7. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? They try to quote the Old Testament to Jesus like he doesn't know it, trying to play some Bible trivia with Jesus. That's a bad move, okay? Look at how he responds in verse 8. They're like, hey, well, why is divorce mentioned in the Old Testament? Verse 8. He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. What does Jesus say here? Divorce was not a part of God's original intent and design. He wants them to see that. Marriage is meant to be a covenant between a man and a woman for life, till death do you part. He says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for the case of sexual immorality, not based on your definition of indecency, not because she burnt your toast, not because of irreconcilable differences. Sorry, had to say it. But except in the case where there's a severing of the covenant because of infidelity. If you divorce her for your own selfish desires, you have committed adultery. And in Matthew 5, he actually says, you're forcing her into the same thing. She's got to get married to survive. And you're actually forcing her into that. He's actually calling them out very strongly in the way that they're treating marriage and treating women as image bearers of God. They're asking questions about what they can get away with, and Jesus is responding with accountability, true righteousness, and affirming the seriousness of marriage. Jesus is coming along here and saying, don't talk to yourself about being right with God while you're throwing those made in the image of God on the streets as sexual property. Okay, that's what's happening here. Jesus is not just casting judgment upon divorced people and abusing people who have been through a divorce. What he's doing is correcting a low, lazy view of marriage. He's correcting it. They're wondering about how far their lust can go, and Jesus is like, hey, I want to uphold the sanctity and the accountability of God's design for marriage, which is why he gets into right after this oath-taking, by the way. We flipped those. We talked about that last week. Now, here's where I'm really going to stick to my notes, all right, everybody? Because I've been in church my whole life. I just want to confess to you that, just being honest, one of the things that has been a struggle for me, my father and my mother were divorced when I was 5 years old. Won't get into all the details around that. But because of some bad teaching on divorce, my dad actually for many years disqualified himself from any form of ministry because of what he was taught about divorce. And I have other stories from not just mine and my wife and our family and the extended family, and I understand that there are so many questions that come up. Again, please write them down. But I want to talk for just a moment about this. So what about us? Are there reasons for divorce biblically? Let's answer that question first. Well, the concession for divorce given in this passage in both is sexual immorality. The Greek word there is porneia. Sounds familiar. It's where you get the word pornography, right? It's talking about sexual brokenness. It's not just adultery, all kinds of sexual promiscuity outside of God's design. But here's what's crazy. I just want to be honest about this. There is a concession for divorce in regards to sexual immorality. There is not a command for it. The Pharisees' language, if you look at it again, they say, why did Moses command them to give a certificate of divorce? Jesus says, hey, it was allowed because of your hardness of heart, because of your sin, to make sure there was a way for women to have an opportunity to get out of the situation that they were in. It was not a command, but there is a concession. Why do I point that out? Well, first of all, experience. I know many men and women who there's been infidelity in their past, and the Lord has graciously allowed the offended party to somehow supernaturally forgive. And there's been healing, and there's been restoration, and a testimony has come out of that. Okay? That happens. I also know the story of Hosea and Gomer. If you know that one, you see God is pointing to something. Hey, Israel, you are adulterous. You are unfaithful. You do not keep your covenant with me. And the story of Hosea and Gomer is the story of God saying, you've broken your covenant. I will not violate my covenant. I will be faithful to you even though you have been unfaithful. So this is important. This is not a command, okay? This is a concession, though. It's there. There is a concession. Also tell a story. One of the hardest moments in my ministry life was sitting down with a couple, and there had been unfaithfulness a couple of weeks after they had gotten married. And I had actually done their premarital counseling, and I did their wedding. And I was sitting there going, oh my goodness, what do I do here? And I'm counseling them, I'm talking to them, and this is the language I used. Hey, where are you guys at with this now? This has happened. Look at the man and said, obviously, I don't need to say anything to you. How could you? You violated the covenant. You made a commitment before God, before me, before all these people that were here. You violated the covenant. And here's what I said. And now we're in a spot where there are grounds for her to decide that she wants to step away from this. But I'm going to ask this question. Where are you guys at? Do you want to move forward with Jesus? Do you want to? And then there's a lot of counsel that took place from there. Praise God. They've got 2 beautiful kiddos now. They're still married, still going strong. Amazing. But I had to be honest in that moment as I looked at the man. She's got grounds, man. She's got grounds. It's not a command, but it is a concession. It is a concession. Okay. 2 other reasons, and I want to say this, and please, actually, just if you have a question, write it down. Okay, this is a long conversation. 2 other reasons I believe you can make a biblical case for at least minimum separation is abuse or abandonment. Abuse or abandonment. That would take a lot of time. That is a walk through the scriptures, but happy to do it with you, okay? But in those situations, the covenant and integrity of marriage has been compromised. You need to get to safety and provision. Please, if you are in an abusive relationship, call the authorities. If it's that place, call them. If you need help, please let us know, okay? But the main point this morning is that biblically, concessions for divorce are way more narrow than many of us realize, okay? And this is not a reality. I'll be truthful. For most of the time, marriage is on the brink of divorce in our culture. For some, yes. Not for all. Reasons to get divorced in the modern age is we don't have anything in common anymore. That's not a biblical concession for divorce. We just don't love each other anymore. Oh, there's so much discipleship that can happen even in that statement of what do you mean? And let's dive into that. Not a concession for divorce. We don't have a good sex life. We're incompatible. Like, yeah, you're incompatible. You're 2 sinners who came together. You had your own kingdom, and now you're fighting each other for who's going to be the king of the castle, right? Toothpaste going to be rolled or just squeezed or stomped on. Some of us, we got kids. There's a lot of them, okay? Well, he or she will just never change. They're not going to change, so I'm out. Let me just say, okay? Those are reasons for counseling and community and repentance and to put in lots and lots of work. Biblically, that's not concession for divorce. If you've been married for any length of time, you go, listen, I love my bride. Talk about incompatible. That woman, we think differently about everything. And then we're very alike in many ways. And on the stubbornness thing, we're very similar. So it's so much fun, right? But if you've been through marriage, like I thinking back to her finding me in my pornography addiction, you could almost make a biblical case that I walked in sexual immorality. And in that moment, what did she do? She met me with some strong, strong words, but with the grace to say, hey, I love you. This has destroyed me. I feel like you don't love me. There's so much that happened there. But listen, we leaned in together. And I just want to keep saying that because in our culture, there's times where this has been used as a club and we want to talk about that, but also divorce just happens so flippantly in our society. The marriage covenant has become something that's like, oh yeah, it's viewed as a contract. When it works for me and it works for you, we'll stay together. But if it starts to get difficult, we're out. That is not what Jesus calls us to. And what he's saying here in viewing the marriage covenant in a high way as followers of Jesus is that this is an amazing witness. Again, salt and light to a world that views marriage so flippantly. How countercultural is this? Man, I think about even back just a Christian man, hanging out with buddies, we're going golf, and how quickly it could become, yeah, my wife did this and she did that, and you don't deserve that, man. You gotta, it's awful. This is what happens in our culture. Rather than, hey, bro, I get it. I know you're frustrated. I get you're venting to me, but remember that she's a gift to you, and God has given her to you, and you're called to love her and honor her and cherish her. So maybe you need to go home and apologize because you're being a jerk right now. You guys know what I'm talking about. You got these conversations. The marriage covenant, Jesus says, hold it in high regard. What about remarriage? Oh my goodness. I'm 1 minute and 55 seconds over, so that's a difficult question, but here's what I'll say. I read probably 400 pages of stuff around this topic this week about remarriage specifically of, look at the early church, look at all these commentaries. Can I tell you, most faithful Christians agree on this. Remarriage may be permissible. A couple things I want to say, but it should be carefully examined by the 2 individuals, not flippantly running into a second, third, fourth, fifth marriage. Okay? And I don't say that to shame. Again, my wife and I, we got stories from our family. Okay? Should be done with serious consideration about the heart of God and walking into it as disciples of Jesus. And biblically speaking, here's a simple way to put it. The witness of the scriptures is where there is legitimate divorce, there is legitimate remarriage. Sexual immorality, there's been separation, remarriage. Now, again, that opens up a lot of questions, but here's what I want to land on, okay? Because here's where I think some of you in the room maybe watching this online, maybe you're in a spot, well, here's my question. I've been divorced already, and I've been remarried. And what if now I'm hearing this and I'm going, I didn't do this the right way? What about then? Sloppy teaching has been devastating to the body of Christ on this. I say it again. Bad teaching on this passage has been devastating to the body of Christ, where it's focused on past and not an invitation into being a disciple of Jesus. I'm going to share this story. I still got 6 minutes. Okay, Super Bowl's later. You're fine. Everybody wake up. In a discipleship group with a bunch of guys that we met for like 2 years at McDonald's early in the morning. And randomly, this happens from time to time, this guy who we didn't really know just started like slowly making his way to our table to sit with us. And he showed up and he had this very unique theology. This was his text. This is what he was about. And what had happened is his wife, many years prior, had divorced him. And there was sexual immorality, so it was a really interesting conversation. But he believed that the right response at this point for her, who she'd been married for almost a decade, she had a family, she had kids, in his mind, hey, God put us together, she left me, so now she needs to repent, divorce her husband, leave her family, and come back to me. Because what God, you see what I mean about sloppy teaching? Here's the thing, like, you're asking the question, you've been divorced, you're like, man, where am I at on all this? I was in the boat of Jesus said, you've already committed adultery. You're like, I'm an adulterer on multiple. You're sitting here going, what do I do with this? Can I just tell you, here's what God says about divorce. God hates divorce. That is in the scriptures, but he doesn't hate divorced people. The whole of the scriptures is about God reconciling to us. All of us have been unfaithful. All of us have broken covenant. Okay, all of us. And what did Jesus do for our past sin? What did he do? He died on the cross to make atonement for our sin. He forgives us and then invites us to walk with him in newness of life. So what do we do? If you're in that spot and you're like, man, I'm one of the people you mentioned earlier, maybe when it comes to lust or when it comes to divorce, what do I do now? Here's what we do. Lord Jesus, I'm so sorry for my sin. We mourn. God, I didn't do this the right way. I treated my wife horribly. I treated my husband horribly. We divorced for silly grounds, and we did so many things that devastated our family. Now, what do we do now? Listen, this is what the gospel of grace is. You're invited into newness of life. This is, hey, I paid for your sin. Now follow after me. What Jesus is concerned with this morning is, hey, what are you doing now? Are you submitting to Jesus now? Are you seeking to honor him now? Are you married? Okay. Are you seeking to honor him now in your marriage? Are you seeking to honor him? Are you struggling with lust? Have you been addicted to pornography and you look back at your life and the things it's done? He says, what are you doing now? Are you willing to wage war? Are you willing to lay that down? Are you willing to see it as ugly and hate it like I hate it because it's destructive to you? And then are you willing to come to me to find healing and cleansing and then follow me into what will bring you life? That's the question. For a disciple, it's, hey, come to me, follow me now. But here's the problem with us as people. We're still Pharisees. And we want to pull the club out. What did you do in your past? Oh, canceled, condemned. All right, let me beat you over the head with this and leave you with no hope. That is not who our Jesus is. He increases. He takes the law and says, hey, I'm going to elevate this. Just so you know, you have missed it. You are a sinner. Oh, but blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who see their need for me, turn to me, and then follow me into newness of life. So in closing, a couple things. If you're considering divorce, can I just, listen, if there's abuse, get to safety, call help. Like, I just want to be very clear about that. By the way, we're the kind of church where if there is abuse, we don't do the like, hey, the elders are going to come. No, we're going to call the cops. Just so you're aware, like we take that very seriously when it comes to harm against children or abuse like that. The church is not, we're not. God gave the authority to someone to adjudicate that. We're not the adjudicators. If that offends you, I'm sorry. No, I'm not. I'm not really sorry, okay? But if you are considering divorce, please pump the brakes just enough to say, hold on, is this legitimate or is this, I'm just not happy, okay? This doesn't mean, listen, you might need some serious counseling. Go get that counseling. Doesn't mean you minimize the issues, but hey, can just slow down, pray, take this to Jesus and consider that. And then lastly, all right, hope you're writing down your questions. Again, pursuit's going to be a lot of fun. I just want to share this text. So in the book of 1 Corinthians, if you're not familiar, John, we won't sing because I'm going to wrap right on time. In the book of 1 Corinthians, you see Paul is addressing some really significant sexual sin in the church. Lots of different sexual sin in the church. And he's going to address it a whole lot, all the way up to chapter 5. And then the back end of chapter 6, he gives a lot of practical things about walking out of it. But I want to share one verse with you that I think is really beautiful. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11 says this, "And such were some of you." Did you hear that? It's who you used to be. "But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God." Such were some of you. This is who you were. But I've rescued you, I've saved you, and now I'm inviting you. Follow me into newness of life. Number 5, Jesus is building his kingdom through redeemed sinners. He calls you saints now when you're in him. It's a beautiful truth. Sons and daughters, co-heirs. It's a beautiful thing. We were washed, sanctified, justified. So here's how we're going to wrap. It's going to be really simple this morning. What is Jesus calling you to do in response to his word this morning? Some of you need to war against lust. Some of you need to get honest and confess past sin. This is not a minimizing of the brokenness that we have caused. We need to own that and confess that before the Lord. Some, you need to stop walking in shame and condemnation and actually receive grace. Remember, hey, that's who you were. And this is why we love baptism here. And we baptize all the way down the water and bring them up. Why? As a picture, a demonstration of old is going down. Because of what Jesus has done, the new is rising up. Walk in newness of life. I'm going to say it again. I don't know why. Some of you are so stuck in condemnation because of something surrounding one of these topics from your past. It's actually hindering your walk with the Lord because you're not receiving the truth of the gospel and what that really means for you. He paid for your sin and invites you to walk forward into newness of life.